From Channel 5 in the 1970s to the Peace Corps to traveling around the world, Charleston Center for Women Director Jennet Robinson Altman has done it all, and now she's ready for the next chapter in her life. I had a chance to talk with her for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. Well, Jennet, let's go back to last week when you publicly announced that you would retire, actually resign from your position here at the Charleston Center for Women. You know, I'm wondering, after 12 years at the helm of this place, and as we sit here right now, how difficult was it to go to the board of directors and say, hey, I'm leaving?
Well, I thought about it for a long time, and to be perfectly honest, 12 years is a long time to be the director of a nonprofit agency. And I'm very proud of what we've been able to accomplish in the last 12 years. We've really made the Center for Women a force to be reckoned with. People are talking about women's issues now more than ever, and particularly the economic issues, which is what we focus on. So I felt that the center is in a good, solid place where if I was going to make a transition, now is the time to do it. And whenever I speak publicly, people always know that I'm going to say, I'm Jennet Robinson Altman, and I have the best job in Charleston because I get to work at the Center for Women.
Yes.
And I think it's time for someone else to have the best job in Charleston. And I'm leaving with a certain amount of sadness, but at the same time, with great pride about what we've been able to accomplish, and I'm ready to go and start my own business.
And speaking of that, we were talking on Tuesday, and you told me you wanted to go into the consulting business.
Yes.
Because?
Well, because over the years I've been getting calls from other organizations and other communities that are interested in either developing women's leadership programs and in many cases women's entrepreneurial training programs. And those are two areas in which I have a lot of expertise. So I'm going to take it on the road, as it were, and try and replicate a lot of what we've done here in other communities.
You know, I actually want you to walk me down memory lane for just a moment. Take me back. How easy or hard was it to take this position back in March of 2011?
2001.
2001.
Well, it was an interesting time for the organization. There had been no full-time staff in over a year. There were about 45 members. There was less than $20,000 in the bank and a big mortgage on the office building. And I'm proud to say that I saw it as an organizational challenge, but also because I am from this community, and also combined with the fact that I've worked in a lot of other countries around issues of women in development, I knew that there was a need for it in this community. So I really saw it as a challenge, but I also knew that the community would eventually support it, and that's why I did it.
That is good to hear. I just lost my script, so forgive me for saying March of 2011.
That's all right.
During this particular time of your 12 years here, a lot of monumental things have happened.
Oh, yeah.
Including a generous gift from Oprah in 2006.
Well, that was quite the tipping point for us, I have to say. Oprah announced that she was coming to do her Live Your Best Life workshop and that she would be giving a grant to a local nonprofit. So we, along with every other nonprofit within a 500-mile radius, sent an email to O Magazine, which were the sponsors of the workshop.
Right.
And very much to my surprise, we got the call about 10 days before she was coming, asking us to submit a grant proposal. And I found out later, after she awarded us a $25,000 grant in front of 3,000 people at the North Charleston Fine Arts Center, I found out later that we were the only organization that had been asked to submit a proposal. And it was interesting. I said, how did you find us? Did you send someone here to do research? And they said, no, we did our entire search online. Well, we have an excellent website, and we have invested in our website since day one. And what it showed me was the absolute power of the internet and the fact that if you don't have a credible presence online, people aren't going to take you seriously.
That's right. And you know, when we were talking also on Tuesday, you talked to me about a lot of stumbling blocks that you ran into as a woman. Do you believe this particular job has opened you to basically bring those blocks down?
Oh, I think I tore them down long before I came here. But what I had to learn running the Center for Women was tearing down the blocks with a lot of people in this community who really aren't at a place where they understand how important it is to have diversity in the management of organizations as well as on governing boards and commissions. And I think the Southeast is somewhat slow to come to that. But the reality is, if you look at the Fortune 500 companies, the one thing that the highest earning companies have in common is that they have a representative number of women on their senior management teams and on their corporate boards.
Wow.
So we're trying to bring that message to Charleston.
You know, I want to continue to walk down memory lane to the time when you were working at the Peace Corps.
Yeah, well, I did it twice, actually.
Yes.
I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the late 70s.
1977 to 79.
Yeah, 79. And I went to Afghanistan. And this is before anybody knew where Afghanistan was.
Right.
I was there before the Russians invaded.
Right.
And it was one of those life-altering experiences because I was put in charge of a program to develop health education materials for women who couldn't read or write. And it got me out into the rural areas of the country, and what I saw shocked me to my core. The women in Afghanistan have virtually no power.
Right.
They can't vote.
Right.
Most of them don't get an education. They can't own land. They have no access to reproductive health care. It is the most miserable place for women on the planet. And I spent 2 years there, and as I said, it had a profound effect on me. And I saw where just because someone can't read or write does not mean they're stupid.
Right.
These bright, wonderful women who made the best of their situations, and when they had any income that they could control, they spent it on health and education. And that's what we see with women all over the world. If you empower a woman economically, you're taking care of an entire family.
Yeah.
And that family then contributes to the overall health of the community.
Yeah. Let's go back to 1973.
Wow. Okay.
I read too that you actually came home during the summer of 73.
Yeah.
And your father was happy to have you.
Yes.
But he told you to get a job.
I had to get a job. I just graduated from college. I went through in 3 years, and I thought, well, I'll take a little break.
Yeah.
You know, my father, Jennet Robinson, was a product of the Depression,
Yes.
and you had to be employed if you weren't in school.
Yeah.
And so I panicked, and because I had a liberal arts degree,
Yeah.
I hadn't taken accounting. I couldn't even type. So I started calling around my parents' friends and trying to find a job, and I called one friend of theirs who worked at Channel 5, WCSC. You're also an alum of Channel 5.
That's right.
And they needed a temporary receptionist for 2 weeks.
Yes.
And I took the job. And then halfway into that, somebody else went on vacation, and I took their job. And I ended up doing 6 different jobs within the television station. And then an opening came up for someone to read the news in the early morning show that CBS carried.
Yeah.
And nobody wanted to do it. They didn't want to get up that early. So I volunteered for it.
Yeah.
And I went on to become a full-time news reporter and anchor of the 11 o'clock report.
Yeah. And during that particular time, I read too that you actually were chosen by the Charleston Jewish Community Center.
Yes, to go to Israel. I went to Israel in the spring of 1974, and I was present during one of the great disasters of that particular time when 80 school children were being held hostage in a schoolhouse in Ma'alat. And that was the only time that Golda Meir ever negotiated with terrorists because of children being involved. And unfortunately, the negotiations fell apart, and I was one of a group of reporters who literally were standing outside of the building at the time. The Israelis ended up charging the schoolhouse and trying to save as many of the kids as they could.
And I understand too that that particular event, if I was right, actually led you to not go back to television news.
Well, I came back and did another year and realized that this was not the field that I wanted to be in. I felt that I didn't have the emotional strength and maturity to really continue in that field. However, I learned very quickly and strongly how important the media is in changing behaviors. And so that lesson has stayed with me to this day, how important the media is.
And you went back to the Peace Corps.
I went back to the Peace. Actually, I did a second time, and that was 10 years after I was a volunteer.
Right.
And I went to Southern Africa and was the Peace Corps country director in Swaziland.
Where you helped a lot of people who were
well,
poor.
it was interesting. It's a very small country. It's less than 1 million people. And at the time I was there, one of its neighbors, South Africa, was still under apartheid. The other neighbor, Mozambique, was in the middle of a civil war, and most of our Peace Corps volunteers were teaching in high schools, teaching math and science and things like that, because there weren't enough Swazi teachers to do that.
And building your memory hat, what did you take away from that particular experience?
Well, interestingly enough, there I'd been in Afghanistan seeing where women couldn't vote and they didn't get an education and they had very, very few rights. Swaziland, it was the same thing. So I realized that I was getting this very strong message that I needed to pay attention to what was going on with women around the world. And after I left Southern Africa, I spent 6 years on senior staff with Peace Corps in Washington and worked on projects in 47 countries. So I literally have seen it all.
Yeah, and unfortunately the Peace Corps were actually forced out of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And you returned here to Charleston to go to MUSC.
I went to MUSC briefly before I had that wonderful job, which was press secretary for the first woman. She was the first woman ever elected statewide in South Carolina, Nancy Stevenson. She was lieutenant governor.
That's right.
And she called me up and she said, I know you have TV background and I want you to come up and be my press secretary. And I thought, move to Columbia? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it was an opportunity for me to learn how the legislature worked and how state government worked.
Yeah.
And that was valuable, wonderful experience. And it was also interesting to see how people responded to Nancy in that role, because there was no role model for a woman elected at that level. So we got sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly when it came to how people treated us.
And isn't it true that you guys created some sort of support group?
Well, there were a group of us. Nancy was not part of this group, but there were a group of us, which include the now Chief Justice Jean Toll, Ginger Crocker, who was in the legislature at the time, Inez Tannenbaum, former Secretary of Education. There were 6 of us, and we started meeting for dinner once a month. And we quickly realized that we needed to do that on a regular basis because we were all dealing with either the good old boy system or other forms of bias and discrimination. And so we created what we called Therapeutic Dinner Group.
Yes.
And it was a support group. It really was. And red wine played a large part in it, but we all agreed that whatever we discussed would stay within the group, and it allowed us to do some great group problem solving as well as individual stuff.
Yeah. Well, take me back to Christmas Day of 1988.
Ooh, you've done your homework.
Yeah.
My father died.
Right. Tell me, how did that day started and how did it end?
Well, the day started, he was in intensive care at Roper St. Francis.
Sure.
And we were called early in the morning because he had been in a coma, and they called us and said that, you know, he was having issues and we needed to go right over. And he had a do not resuscitate, but they hadn't honored that. And so we had to have the conversation that if this were to happen again, to please, you know, abide by his wishes.
Sure.
And they called again, and we went back home and called again about half an hour later, and he died. So we came back to the house, and it was sort of, it was interesting. He'd been ill. We knew that he was at peace with himself. We'd all had plenty of time to express our love for him, and he to us. But it was Christmas morning, and it wasn't the sort of thing where you wanted to start calling people. So we had a very, it was my sister, her husband, her little boy, my mother, and me. And we had a very loving, intimate Christmas as a result of that. Yeah. And then later that day, we started calling people, and it was amazing, the outpouring of love and affection and admiration for Emmett Robinson.
Yeah.
You know, he defined theater in this town for 2 generations.
That's right.
And of course, my mother was a very important part of that. But to see the numbers of people, the wide diversity of people who had been touched by him was quite wonderful.
Yeah. And I understand, too, that after that death, you actually went back overseas for the Peace Corps.
Well, I had been in Swaziland for about 1.5 years, and I flew home when Dad got sick. And so, yes, I did. I turned around and went back. And
how difficult was that?
It was hard. It was really hard. I stayed on for another 2 weeks to really sort of help my mother. And the director of the Peace Corps at the time, Lorette Miller Rupi, called me every single day to make sure I was okay. She had been to visit in Swaziland 2 weeks before this happened. And so she said, you take your time. And then 3 months after that happened, I was back in Swaziland, and Ashley Hall started a Women in Leadership series and invited me to come and be the first speaker. So I got to come back home 3 months after my father died and really be able to make things happen and try to sort out the affairs.
Yeah. And just when your life was just getting back together, something else happened. Your mom had a stroke.
Well, I'd been in Washington. I left Swaziland. I came to Washington. I spent almost 6 years there, and then Mom had a stroke, and she asked me to move home. Okay. And of course, I moved home.
Sure.
My mother, she'd never asked anything of me. So, and I was in the federal system, so I was able to get another job with a federal government agency here, and I moved back home, and then I had what I call the best luck of my life, because 9 months after I moved home, I met Jack Alterman.
That's right. Well, finish these sentences for me.
Okay.
Falling in love with Jack was?
Like being hit by a 2x4.
Mary Baldwin College was?
Interesting in that it didn't really encourage women's leadership at the time in the early 70s, but definitely gave me a good frame of reference.
Ashley Hall School is?
Ashley Hall gave me the beginning of my leadership development, and I credit Ashley Hall 100%.
Yes. Theater is?
Theater is an ability, theater is a way to convey emotions to people through another character that you might not be able to do personally.
Yes. The Charleston Center of Women is?
Charleston Center for Women is the place to go if you want to figure out what life success is going to look like for you.
Yes. Jennet Robinson Altman is
ready to set the world on fire with a consulting business.
Yes. And when you look into your crystal ball, what do you see?
I see in my crystal ball, 10 years from now, there being centers for women developed all over the Southeast, and more women in leadership roles, more women holding political office, more women having business success, so that we can start changing attitudes and providing more opportunities for people to be successful in their lives.
Jennet Robinson Altman, it was so great talking to you.
Thank you, Quintin. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Anytime.